The cemetery was quiet in the way only post-war places could be. Not peaceful. Exhausted. It was the kind of silence that came after too much noise, too many screams, too many names spoken for the last time. The earth here had learned to absorb sound the way it absorbed bodies, without reaction, without protest. Even the birds avoided it, as if instinctively aware that this ground had been asked to do too much. May 17th, 1951. A provincial town in Central Europe. One of hundreds that had survived the war not through heroism or resistance, but through irrelevance. It had been too small for strategic bombing, too far from rail hubs to matter, too morally flexible to become a symbol. No grand destruction, no grand memory, just survival. No monuments yet, no plaques. The language of remembrance had not caught up with the reality of loss. The dead lay beneath cheap stone and wooden crosses, many without dates, some without names, others marked only by fading pencil scratches that rain and frost were slowly erasing. This cemetery had grown faster than the town. At 09:40 in the morning, a coffin was lowered into the ground. It was plain. Pine wood. Light enough that 6 men could handle it without effort. There was no flag, no insignia, no suggestion that the body inside had once worn a uniform, carried a weapon, or belonged to a cause now officially concluded. The priest stood at the edge of the grave, his voice steady but empty. He had learned to read the words without letting them pass through him. Years earlier, he had still paused at certain phrases. Now, they flowed automatically, like a mechanism that continued to operate long after belief had become optional. He had buried too many men who looked older than their years, faces carved by hunger, eyes dulled by prolonged fear, and too many who looked younger than their documents claimed, boys turned into soldiers before their bodies had finished becoming human. This man was neither. The mourners were few, 3, perhaps 4, standing at a distance that suggested obligation rather than grief. None had known the deceased well. None would have recognized him if they had passed him on the street a month earlier. They had been informed. They had shown up. That was all. No one cried. The wind moved briefly through the trees, lifting dust from the paths between the graves, then settled again, as if even it were tired of participating. The doctor stood apart. He had chosen his position deliberately, far enough not to be mistaken for family, close enough to see the coffin clearly as it descended. He was a man in his 40s, though the lines on his face suggested more years than his documents admitted. War had done that to people. It accelerated aging without offering the dignity of wisdom in return. He was holding a folder he should not have been holding. It was thin, but heavy in the way only paper can be when it contains too much certainty. Cardboard cover, string binding. The edges were worn soft from repeated handling. Not ceremonial, not final. Inside were 3 death certificates, not copies, originals, each issued by a different authority, each bearing the same name, each bearing a different date, the same date of birth, the same identifying scars, the same physical description written in different hands, with different phrasing, but describing the same body with unsettling precision. A scar above the left rib, damage to the right knee, a childhood injury to the hand, noted almost casually, as if it were an afterthought, yet present every time. The handwriting differed. One certificate was rushed, angular, written during wartime chaos when doctors signed forms between shellings and sleep deprivation. Another was careful, almost elegant, produced in the brief moment after liberation when procedures mattered again. The third was precise, typed, stamped, reviewed. Different inks, different stamps, different eras. The doctor knew them all. He had signed the first one in 1945, as a junior medical officer newly promoted, still trying to convince himself that paperwork mattered. He remembered the room, the smell of disinfectant barely masking decay, the way his hand had shaken then too, though for different reasons. He had reviewed the second one in 1943, during wartime chaos, when bodies arrived faster than they could be documented, when death became a process rather than an event. He had not questioned it. No one did. The soldier had been one name among hundreds. And now, in 1951, he was signing the third. The same man. Again. His hand trembled slightly, a movement so small no one else noticed. The priest continued speaking. The mourners stared at the ground. The coffin descended centimeter by centimeter, controlled, obedient, final. The doctor's mind did not follow it. Instead, it moved backward. To February 1943, to July 1945, to rooms filled with bodies that no longer responded to voices, to a face that, in death, looked strangely familiar, not because he had known the man personally, but because he had already accepted his end once before. Twice. He opened the folder. Against regulation, against training, against everything he had been taught about the necessity of clean records, he picked up his pen. In the margin of the form, a space never meant for interpretation, he wrote a sentence, not as a theory, not as a question, as a fact. Identity corresponds to two previously deceased individuals under the same name. The ink soaked slightly into the paper. Later, much later, an archivist would circle that sentence in red pencil. The archivist would pause, reread it, then close the file. He would never mention it in official correspondence. He would never bring it up in meetings, but he would remember it. At 09:47, the coffin disappeared beneath the soil. The sound of earth hitting wood was dull, unremarkable, identical to the sound it had made thousands of times before. No echo, no protest. The ground accepted the weight without complaint. At 09:52, the file was officially closed. Stamped, filed, archived. For the third time, the state declared the soldier dead. No review was scheduled, no investigation ordered, no anomaly acknowledged. The machinery of post-war normalcy moved forward, relieved to seal yet another irregularity beneath forms and signatures. No one asked how many deaths were necessary for a man to stay buried. And no one noticed that, as the mourners began to leave, the doctor remained standing, staring at the grave with the expression of someone who had just witnessed the end of something that had never fully belonged to the living. Eastern Front, February 3, 1943. The first death was ordinary. That was what made it absolute. By February 1943, death on the Eastern Front had lost its individuality. It was no longer dramatic or unexpected. It arrived on schedules, followed patterns, filled forms. It was recorded in neat columns, abbreviated, categorized. Men stopped asking if someone would die and started asking how many. February 3, 1943, was a cold day even by Eastern Front standards. The temperature had dropped below -20 degrees Celsius overnight. Metal burned bare skin. Breath crystallized instantly. Weapons jammed. Wounds froze before they bled. The soldier belonged to an infantry unit already reduced far below operational strength. Officially, the company numbered 92 men. In reality, fewer than 50 could still walk without assistance. Frostbite, exhaustion, and untreated infections had become as dangerous as enemy fire. Their position was temporary. It was always temporary. The orders had been unclear. Hold, delay, withdraw if necessary. Communications were unreliable. Maps were outdated. The front line existed mostly on paper, shifting faster than anyone could redraw it. At approximately 14:20 hours, artillery fire began. Not sporadic shelling, not probing fire. Sustained bombardment. The first shells landed short, throwing up columns of frozen earth. The second wave adjusted. By the third, the ground itself seemed to convulse. Trenches collapsed inward. Snow turned gray, then black. 17 minutes. That number appears repeatedly in the reports. 17 minutes of continuous fire. 17 minutes was enough to erase a position completely. Witness testimony was collected weeks later, when there was time and paperwork demanded it. One soldier described hearing a sound, like the sky tearing open. Another remembered the pressure more than the noise, the way his chest felt crushed from the inside. The soldier was standing slightly ahead of the others when a shell landed close enough to lift him off the ground. He did not scream. That detail appears in both testimonies. He was thrown forward, disappearing briefly in smoke and debris. When visibility returned, he was on the ground, unmoving. One witness saw blood on the snow, dark, spreading, immediately freezing at the edges. Another noticed that the soldier's helmet had been blown several meters away. Neither saw him breathe. Neither approached him. Approaching the fallen during bombardment was not bravery. It was suicide. The fire continued. Orders to withdraw came late. By the time the unit pulled back, daylight was fading and the position was no longer defensible. Bodies were left behind. This was not unusual. The frozen ground made retrieval impossible even under safe conditions. Under fire, it was unthinkable. At 18 hours, the company commander compiled the casualty list by lantern light. The soldier's name appeared under a familiar heading, KIA, confirmed. The confirmation was procedural. 2 witnesses. Observed fatal injury. No signs of life. That was enough. The list was signed and forwarded up the chain. Another copy went to the battalion office. A third would eventually reach a civilian clerk far from the front. 3 days later, on February 6th, a patrol briefly returned to the area. The bombardment had stopped. The enemy had advanced, then moved on. The position was now no man's land. The patrol's task was limited. Retrieve identification where possible. Destroy sensitive materials. Confirm losses. They found bodies frozen in place, twisted into unnatural positions by the force of explosions and the rigidity of cold. Some were partially buried. Others were unrecognizable. Near what had once been the forward trench, they recovered personal effects consistent with the soldier's identity. An identification tag, fragments of uniform fabric, a torn photograph, too damaged to identify the faces. A field medic examined what remained. The examination was brief. There were signs of massive trauma, shrapnel damage, internal injuries that would have been fatal, even under ideal medical conditions. Time of death was estimated as February 3, 1943. Cause of death, blast trauma. The medic noted that recovery of a full body was impossible due to conditions. The report was stamped. The file was closed. From a bureaucratic perspective, the case was flawless. Every required step had been completed, every form properly signed, every assumption supported by evidence. In April 1943, the soldier's family received notification. The letter followed a standard template. The language was formal, respectful, impersonal. He fell in battle. He fulfilled his duty. He will be remembered. There was no body to return. There rarely was. By May, his name appeared on a temporary memorial list posted in a municipal building. By summer, it had been transferred into regional records. Eventually, it would be etched into stone. The soldier ceased to exist as a living person and became a data point. This was how the war handled death. Efficiently, finalistically, without room for error. Years later, doctors reviewing the case would note something unsettling. Not because of what was missing, but because of what was present. The certainty. There was no ambiguity in the language. No presumed. No missing. No conditional phrasing. Killed in action. Confirmed. The witnesses had no doubts. The medic had no doubts. The commanding officer had no doubts. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing part. Because if the first death had been uncertain, if there had been chaos, confusion, missing records, everything that followed might have been easier to explain. But there was none of that. The soldier did not disappear. He did not slip through gaps in documentation. He did not become a rumor. He died, thoroughly, officially, beyond dispute. which meant that whatever returned from the battlefield later was not the result of clerical error or misplaced identity. It was something that had already been buried by the war itself. At the time, no one noticed anything unusual. They could not afford to. The Eastern Front consumed thousands of men every day. One more death, even a well-documented one, did not deserve special attention. The ground froze over again that night. Snow covered the field, and the first death settled into history, complete and unquestioned. Occupied Eastern Europe, September 1944. The camp did not announce itself. It appeared gradually, as if it had grown out of the mud and wire rather than been constructed. Watchtowers leaned at slightly different angles, their silhouettes uneven against the low sky. Barbed wire ran in loose, sagging lines that had been repaired too many times with whatever metal could be found. The gate stood open more often than closed, not as an invitation, but because there were too many bodies to process and too few men left who cared about appearances. September 1944 arrived without relief. The summer had broken the prisoners' bodies. The autumn would test whatever remained. On the morning the transport arrived, the clerk at registration table 3 was already tired. He had been tired for years. The ledger in front of him was thick with names written in different hands, crossed out, corrected, annotated, sometimes written twice when the first entry turned out to be wrong. He did not look up as the column of men shuffled forward. Most of them barely resembled soldiers. They moved cautiously, as if the ground itself might give way. Some leaned on each other. Some stared straight ahead, lips moving silently. Others had the distant look of men who had already left their bodies behind and were operating on something close to memory alone. The clerk asked the same questions he always asked: name, date of birth, place of enlistment. The answers usually arrived slurred, delayed, or incomplete. Then one man stepped forward and spoke clearly. The name stopped the clerk's pen. He read it once, then again. It was a name he had already seen, not recently, months earlier, under a different heading. The clerk did not react immediately. Errors were common. Prisoners lied. Some borrowed names from the dead to escape punishment or to hide desertion. Others clung to familiar identities because they were the last things left intact. The clerk assumed deception. He asked again. The answer did not change. Date of birth. Correct. Place of origin. Correct. The clerk glanced up for the first time. The man standing in front of him was thin, almost skeletal, but not in the frantic way hunger usually produced. His movements were slow, controlled. His posture was upright, though strained. His eyes were open and focused but distant, as if he were looking through the clerk rather than at him. The clerk asked about identifying marks. The man lifted his shirt without being told. A scar above the left rib. The same scar noted in the file of a man killed in action in February 1943. The clerk's throat tightened. He reached for the auxiliary ledger kept under the table, the one used for irregularities. He flipped through it quickly, fingers moving faster than his thoughts. There it was. The name. Crossed out. Marked KIA. Confirmed. The clerk looked back at the man. "You're aware," he said carefully, "that according to our records you're dead." The man did not react. After a moment, he nodded. "Yes," he said. "That sounds right." The clerk waited for a smile, a smirk, some sign that this was a game. Nothing came. "How did you survive?" the clerk asked. The man considered the question seriously, as if he were being asked something complicated rather than impossible. "I didn't," he said. The clerk laughed once, sharply, then stopped when he realized the man was not joking. The officer on duty was called. The officer had seen enough strange things by 1944 that very little surprised him anymore. Entire villages emptied overnight. Men arrived speaking languages no one recognized. Prisoners claimed to be from units that no longer existed. Still, this was unusual. The officer reviewed the documents. He compared the physical description to the wartime casualty report retrieved from a battered archive box. The similarities were precise to the point of discomfort. Height, eye color, scars. Even the handwriting describing the childhood injury to the hand was almost identical, though written by different people. The officer closed the file. "You understand," he said slowly, "that this creates a problem." The man nodded again. "I don't intend to cause one," he replied. That answer, recorded later by a guard who overheard the exchange, disturbed the officer more than any protest would have. The man was registered provisionally. No final determination was made. There were too many prisoners arriving, too few staff, and too little appetite for investigations that would not change the outcome of the war. He was assigned a number, given a blanket, directed to Barrack 7. The system moved on. Medical inspection followed 2 days later. The camp doctor was a man who had long since abandoned hope of healing anyone. His task was to determine who could work, who might recover, and who would die soon enough to not require resources. He examined the man without comment at first. Weight dangerously low, muscle mass severely reduced, signs of old fractures, ribs, knee, possibly clavicle, scarring consistent with shrapnel wounds. What stood out was not the damage. It was the absence of reaction. The doctor pressed firmly against a healed rib fracture. "Do you feel this?" he asked. "Yes," the man answered. The doctor pressed harder. "And this?" "Yes." "Does it hurt?" The man paused. "I think it should," he said. The doctor wrote that down. He did not know why. He only knew that if he did not, he would remember it. The neurological examination showed delayed responses, but no paralysis. Reflexes were present, though diminished. The man followed instructions precisely. His pulse was weak, but steady. "Any pain?" the doctor asked finally. "No," the man said. The doctor stared at him for a long moment. Everyone here was in pain. Pain was the one thing the camp produced reliably. "You've been injured before," the doctor said. "Yes." "Severely." "Yes." "And yet you're standing." The man shrugged slightly. "It hasn't stopped me yet." The doctor felt an unexpected chill. Barrack 7 housed men who were expected to last. Not long, just long enough. They slept on wooden platforms, stacked 2 levels high. Lice were constant. Coughing never stopped. At night, some men screamed without waking. The man took an upper bunk and remained there whenever he was not assigned work. He spoke little. He did not complain. He did not trade. Those around him noticed things slowly. He never flinched when struck. When guards beat prisoners for moving too slowly, most cried out, begged, or collapsed. The man absorbed blows without sound, adjusting his posture afterward, as if correcting a minor inconvenience. He worked longer hours than required. When others stopped from exhaustion, he continued until ordered to stop. Once, a fellow prisoner asked him why. The man answered honestly. "If I stop," he said, "there's nothing else." At night, he did not scream. He did not appear to sleep either. A guard once claimed to have seen him sitting upright in the dark, eyes open, staring at nothing for hours. Rumors spread. They always did. Some said he had been buried and dug himself out. Some said he had been blown apart and stitched back together incorrectly. Others whispered that death had simply overlooked him. The man did not encourage these stories. When asked directly how he survived, he gave the same answer every time. "I didn't." In early 1945, as the front collapsed and the camp prepared for evacuation, records were rushed, incomplete, and contradictory. Names were copied hastily. Files were misplaced or destroyed. The man was transferred with a group of prisoners to a medical holding facility for those deemed unfit for immediate release. His provisional status was never resolved. No one followed up. There were too many endings already. Years later, when officials attempted to reconstruct the paper trail, they found something unsettling. The man appeared in transport lists, work rosters, and medical logs, always briefly, never consistently. He was present enough to be recorded, absent enough to avoid explanation. One clerk wrote a note in the margin of a ledger, dated November 1944. Identity unresolved. Subject exhibits abnormal tolerance to injury. No action followed. By the time the war ended, the man had survived conditions that killed others, who were younger, stronger, and less damaged. He should not have been alive. According to the documents, he wasn't. And yet, when liberation came, he walked out of the camp on his own feet, thin, silent, uncelebrated. A man, officially dead for more than a year, carrying a body that had learned to function without the certainty of pain, or the expectation of survival. Medical Holding Facility, July 1945. The war ended unevenly. For some, it ended with flags and crowds, with announcements shouted into streets that had not yet been cleared of rubble. For others, it ended quietly, in rooms that smelled of disinfectant and damp plaster, where men waited to be told whether they were allowed to live again. The facility where the man was taken in July 1945 had once been a school. The chalkboards were still on the walls, faint arithmetic problems visible beneath layers of hastily applied white paint. Classrooms had become wards. Desks had been removed to make space for narrow beds, arranged in rigid rows. The windows were cracked but intact. Light entered without enthusiasm. This was where the war sent the survivors it did not know how to return. Officially, the building was a medical transit center for former prisoners of war, deemed unfit for immediate release. Unofficially, it was a place where authorities stored unresolved bodies until they decided what those bodies were allowed to become. The man arrived on July 8, 1945. His intake form listed him as severely debilitated. His weight was recorded. His pulse was noted as weak but regular. His temperature was slightly below normal. His file contained no final determination of identity, only a provisional registration number carried over from the camp. The admitting nurse asked him if he knew where he was. Yes, he said. She asked him if he knew what year it was. Yes. She asked him if he felt pain. No, he replied. She paused, then wrote "patient denies pain," and moved on. The doctors assigned to the ward worked in 12-hour shifts, though few of them slept when they were not working. They had spent years watching bodies fail in predictable ways. This facility was meant to be easier. The fighting was over. The injuries were old. The worst should have passed. Instead, they encountered men whose systems had adapted to conditions no longer present. The man stood out immediately. Not because he demanded attention, he did not, but because his body did not behave like the others. Most patients alternated between agitation and collapse. Pain returned in waves once the immediate danger was gone. Old wounds reasserted themselves. Nightmares intensified. The body, no longer distracted by survival, remembered what it had endured. The man did not. His vital signs remained stable, even as his strength declined. He ate when instructed. He followed schedules precisely. He did not ask about discharge. During examinations, doctors noted extensive internal damage consistent with prolonged malnutrition and repeated trauma. His heart showed signs of strain. His lungs carried old scarring. His joints moved stiffly, as if lubricated by memory rather than function. And still, he did not complain. One physician, Dr. Keller, became particularly interested in him. Keller had joined the service late in the war and had not yet learned to look away. He read files carefully. He asked questions his colleagues had stopped asking. He reviewed the man's documents and noticed the discrepancy immediately. "This says he was killed in action in 1943, Keller said during a morning round. The nurse shrugged. "Many were." Keller frowned. "This says confirmed." The nurse hesitated. "Then someone made a mistake." Keller looked at the man. "You were declared dead," he said. "Yes," the man replied. "And you disagree?" The man thought for a moment. "No," he said. Keller felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room. Over the next 3 days, the man's condition deteriorated subtly. There was no dramatic collapse, no warning signs that would have triggered immediate intervention. His blood pressure dropped gradually. His pulse became irregular. He grew weaker, but remained conscious. On July 11th, Keller ordered additional tests. The results were alarming. Electrolyte imbalance, signs of cardiac stress, organ systems functioning just above failure thresholds. Keller recommended rest and monitoring. The man nodded when informed. "Are you afraid?" Keller asked impulsively. The man looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Of what?" he asked. Keller did not answer. At approximately 02:10 on July 12, 1945, the night nurse noticed that the man was awake. He was sitting upright in his bed, hands resting on his knees, breathing shallowly. She asked if he needed assistance. "No," he said. At 02:18, his heart rate spiked. At 02:22, he lost consciousness. By the time Keller was called, the man was no longer breathing. Resuscitation efforts began immediately. Chest compressions, artificial respiration, medication. The body responded mechanically at first, then not at all. At 02:30, Keller called the time of death. The nurse wrote it down, July 12, 1945. 2:30 hours, the second death. The autopsy was conducted later that morning. It revealed what the doctors had already suspected: a body that had been pushed far beyond sustainable limits. Severe cardiac damage, systemic organ exhaustion, no evidence of recent injury. Cause of death was listed as cardiac failure following prolonged physiological stress. Routine, except for one line in Keller's notes. Patient exhibited no defensive response to pain stimuli prior to death. Keller hesitated before including it. He knew it would raise questions he could not answer, but leaving it out felt dishonest. He signed the report. The body was prepared for burial. The burial was quiet. There was no ceremony, no family present. The man's identity was still unresolved, and unresolved bodies did not merit ritual. He was buried in a section reserved for those without confirmed next of kin. A wooden marker was placed at the head of the grave. Name, date of death, nothing else. The ground accepted him easily. For the second time, the state recorded his death. Afterward, Keller could not let the case go. He reviewed the earlier records again, paying closer attention this time. He requested the wartime casualty report from 1943. It arrived weeks later, stamped and yellowed. Killed in action, confirmed. 2 deaths, 2 certificates. Same man. Keller wrote a brief inquiry to a regional office, asking whether the earlier death had been reviewed. The response was delayed. When it came, it was short. Wartime records contain known inconsistencies. No further action required. Keller folded the letter and placed it in the file. That should have been the end. It was not. Because within a year, reports began to surface. A man matching the description appeared at a displaced persons camp. Another at a reconstruction site. A labor registry recorded the same name, the same birth date. Keller would not learn this immediately. But the war, which had ended on paper, had not finished repeating itself. And the man who had now died twice had not yet accepted the role assigned to him by history. Central and Eastern Europe, 1946, 1949. The first sighting was dismissed as a clerical error. That was the easiest explanation. And in 1946, ease mattered more than accuracy. Europe was still in motion. Borders had shifted. Governments were provisional, and millions of people existed in a legal limbo between survival and citizenship. Names were written down wherever they could be written. Identities were reconstructed from memory, scars, and habits. Death, too, was often provisional. In March 1946, A labor registration office in a small industrial town recorded a man whose name triggered a quiet inconsistency in the ledger. The clerk paused briefly, flipped back several pages, then continued writing. He assumed the earlier entry had been made in error. The man stayed 3 days. Long enough to be assigned to debris clearance. Not long enough to be questioned. 2 weeks later, the same name appeared again. This time, at a displaced persons camp near the border. Different jurisdiction, different staff. Same date of birth, same physical description. This time, a note was added in the margin. Verify identity if possible. No verification followed. The man left before the weekly review. By 1947, the sightings had become difficult to ignore. They followed no obvious pattern, yet shared details too precise to dismiss. The man appeared in places that attracted those who did not intend to stay. Temporary camps, reconstruction sites, transport hubs. He worked briefly, accepted rations, slept 1 or 2 nights, then disappeared. He never registered twice in the same place. Witnesses struggled to describe him in ways that distinguished him from other displaced men. He was not tall, not short, not particularly striking. His face carried the generic damage of war. Sunken cheeks, faded eyes, scars that told no coherent story. What they remembered was how he reacted to injury. At a construction site in late 1946, a beam slipped from its supports and struck him across the shoulder. The impact was severe enough to knock him to the ground. Others shouted. Someone ran for help. The man stood up on his own. He examined his arm, flexed his fingers, and returned to work. A supervisor later insisted he be sent to a clinic. The nurse pressed against the swelling and asked if it hurt. Yes, the man said. On a scale from 1 to 10? The man hesitated, visibly confused. I don't know what number it's supposed to be, he said. The nurse wrote, possible shock, and released him. Stories accumulated slowly. A guard at a transit camp claimed he had seen the man stand barefoot in snow for several minutes without reacting. A former POW swore he had watched him burn his hand on a stove and only noticed the smell afterward. None of these accounts reached official channels in full. They circulated privately in fragments, stripped of context. By 1948, administrators began to notice something else. The paperwork did not behave correctly. The man's name appeared in places where it should not have been able to appear. A food ration card issued after his recorded burial in July 1945. A work permit stamped in a region that required proof of survival beyond that date. One regional office attempted to reconcile the discrepancies. An inquiry was opened. The clerk assigned to it was young and overly thorough. He requested files from multiple archives, comparing dates, signatures, and stamps. The deeper he went, the worse the picture became. 3 death certificates, each issued correctly, each filed properly, each closing a life that continued to leave traces. The clerk wrote a memo summarizing his findings. Subject appears in post-war records despite confirmed death. Identity duplication or record corruption suspected. He recommended further investigation. The memo was returned with a handwritten note. Insufficient priority. Those who interacted with the man directly noticed something else. He did not talk about the war. Most survivors did, compulsively or defensively. They recited stories as if repetition might reduce their weight. The man did not participate. When asked where he had been, he answered only with locations, never events. When asked what he had seen, he said nothing. When asked how he survived, he gave the same response he always had. I didn't. In one displaced persons camp, a psychologist conducted informal interviews with several men suffering from severe trauma. The man was included almost by accident. The psychologist noted his affect as remarkably flat. No signs of agitation, no visible distress when recounting events that typically triggered emotional responses. When asked about death, the man spoke calmly. It's not what people think, he said. What do they think? the psychologist asked. That it ends, the man replied. The psychologist did not include that exchange in his report. Physically, the man was deteriorating. Witnesses described a gradual decline, slower movements, visible exhaustion, increasing difficulty with manual labor. And yet, he continued to function long after others with similar injuries had collapsed. Doctors who examined him noted extensive internal damage, inconsistent with his level of activity. His heart was enlarged. His lungs showed scarring. His joints moved as if held together by habit rather than tissue. One physician wrote privately, "Body appears to operate without regard for damage signals." The phrase was never formalized. In late 1949, the sighting stopped. Not abruptly, gradually. The last confirmed appearance was recorded in November at a small labor office. The clerk remembered him only because his handwriting was unusually careful. After that, nothing. No more work permits. No more ration cards. No more transit registrations. For a time, administrators assumed the problem had resolved itself. Perhaps the man had emigrated. Perhaps he had finally died, quietly, correctly, without paperwork. No one pursued the matter. The system was relieved to let it go. What no one realized at the time was that the absence itself would soon become another anomaly, because 2 years later, in May 1951, a body would be found. And a doctor would open a folder he should not have been holding, and discover that the war, once again, had refused to let its dead stay dead. Central Europe, May 1951. The body was found on May 14, 1951. There were no witnesses to a collapse, no neighbors who reported screams or disturbances. The man had rented a small room on the second floor of a narrow building near the edge of town, the kind of place that catered to seasonal laborers and people who preferred not to be noticed. He paid weekly. He asked no questions. He kept the door locked. The landlady discovered him when he failed to appear for breakfast. At first, she assumed illness. Many of her tenants disappeared that way. A fever, a cough that worsened overnight, a body that simply decided to stop cooperating. She knocked once, then again. When there was no answer, she unlocked the door with the spare key she kept for emergencies. The man lay on the bed fully clothed. His boots were neatly placed on the floor beside him. His hands rested on his chest, fingers slightly curled, as if he had arranged them consciously. His face was calm. There were no visible signs of distress. He looked like someone who had lain down to rest and forgotten to wake up. The landlady crossed herself and backed out of the room. The police arrived 20 minutes later. The initial assessment suggested a routine death. Middle-aged male. No signs of violence. No indication of forced entry. Likely natural causes. The officer in charge flipped through the man's documents with professional disinterest. They were in order. Issued post-war. Proper stamps. Nothing unusual. Until the name was entered into the regional registry. The clerk at the police station frowned. The system hesitated. A brief pause, just long enough to be noticed. Then a note appeared in the margin of the ledger. Deceased. The clerk assumed a clerical delay. He searched again. Another entry surfaced. Also marked deceased. Different date, different place, same name. The officer leaned over the desk. "Print it," he said. The pages that emerged told a story no one wanted. A confirmed death in February 1943. A medical death in July 1945. Both properly documented. Both closed. The officer ordered the body transported to the municipal hospital for examination. The autopsy was scheduled for the following morning. Dr. Weiss, the pathologist assigned to the case, had seen thousands of corpses by 1951. He approached his work with practiced detachment. Death rarely surprised him anymore. This one did. Not because of the condition of the body. That, at least, was familiar. The man's organs showed extensive damage accumulated over years. Scarring of the lungs, degeneration of cardiac tissue, signs of chronic malnutrition, long past the point of recovery. The body was not healthy. It was barely functional. What unsettled Weiss was the layering. Old injuries overlapped newer ones. Damage that should have ended the body's ability to function had been compensated for somehow, redistributed, rather than repaired. The anatomy suggested prolonged survival without restoration. "This body has been breaking for a long time," Weiss said quietly to his assistant. The assistant nodded. Weiss reviewed the man's paperwork between examinations. That was when he noticed the dates. He stopped working. The medical findings were straightforward. Cause of death, cardiac failure. Contributing factors, systemic exhaustion, long-term physiological stress. There was no medical mystery in how the man died. The mystery was how he had lived. Weiss requested the earlier death certificates. They arrived within hours, carried by a clerk who looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized what he was holding. 3 deaths, 3 signatures, 3 conclusions that contradicted one another without invalidating any of them. Weiss sat down and began to read carefully. The first certificate, 1943, described catastrophic blast trauma. The second, 1945, documented cardiac collapse in a medical facility. The third, the one he was now completing, would mirror the second almost exactly. Weiss compared the physical descriptions. They matched, not approximately, precisely. The same childhood injury, the same scar above the ribs, the same notation regarding pain response, absent or diminished. Weiss felt something close to unease, not fear, recognition. A review committee was convened quietly. No announcement, no formal hearing. Just a small room, 4 men, and a file that refused to behave. A medical officer, a civil registrar, a representative from internal affairs, and Weiss. They examined the documents in silence. Finally, the registrar spoke. "This is impossible," he said. "No," Weiss replied. "It's documented." They debated explanations. Mistaken identity was proposed and rejected. The physical markers were too consistent. Deliberate fraud was suggested. But to what end? The man had not benefited. He had lived poorly, anonymously, and without protection. Clerical error? Perhaps once. But 3 times. One official suggested the records be consolidated. "Choose the most recent," he said. "Invalidate the others." Weiss shook his head. "You can't," he said. "They're correct." The room fell silent. The burial was scheduled for May 17th. This time, the doctor insisted on attending. He stood at a distance from the mourners, holding the folder. Inside were the 3 certificates. He had signed only one of them, but he felt responsible for all 3. At 0940, the coffin was lowered into the ground. At 0947, the earth covered it. At 0952, the registrar stamped the final page. The file was marked closed. A note was added at the end, typed carefully. Further investigation not recommended. Afterward, the documents were archived separately. The earlier files were reclassified. Cross-references were removed. The paper trail was broken deliberately, efficiently, without ceremony. No law had been broken. No rule had been violated. The system had simply decided that the story was over. Years later, historians reviewing fragmented archives would stumble upon the case occasionally. A name that appeared too many times. A life that ended too often. A sequence that did not align. Most would dismiss it. War did that to records, they would say. War created errors. But those who read closely noticed something else. The man had not cheated death. He had outlived the structures designed to define it. And when his body finally failed for the last time, the state buried him quickly. Not out of respect, but out of relief. Because some lives, if examined too closely, reveal not the impossibility of survival, but the terrifying adaptability of the human body when death becomes familiar. The file still exists. Not in one place, not under one reference number, and not in a form that invites discovery. It survives the way certain mistakes survive bureaucracies: scattered, downgraded, misfiled, stripped of urgency. A page in a wartime casualty ledger. A burial register with an overwritten date. A medical report stamped twice, years apart. No single archive contains the whole story. That, in itself, is not unusual. What is unusual is how deliberately the connections between these documents were severed. The first person to notice this was not a soldier, a doctor, or a witness. It was an archivist. In the late 1980s, during the digitization of post-war mortality records in Central Europe, an inconsistency triggered a manual review. A name appeared too often, not in clusters, not within a single chaotic period, but across distinct years: 1943, 1945, 1951. At first glance, it looked like a common problem: overlapping identities in a devastated continent. But when the archivist pulled the original files, he stopped working. Each death had been documented correctly. Each certificate bore legitimate signatures. Each described the same physical markers. There were no annotations explaining the overlap, only absences. Cross-references that should have existed had been removed. Marginal notes stopped abruptly. Inquiry numbers led nowhere, as if they had never been issued. One thing, however, had not been erased. A sentence written in the margin of a 1951 form circled faintly in red pencil. Identity corresponds to two previously deceased individuals under the same name. The archivist copied the sentence into his notes and did not include it in the final database. He would later say, privately, that it felt like a boundary, not a rule, but a warning. Medical historians who later reviewed fragments of the case focused on the body rather than the paperwork. Their conclusions were cautious, deliberately unsensational. The soldier's survival, they argued, may have been the result of extreme physiological adaptation. Under prolonged exposure to starvation, trauma, and stress, the human nervous system can suppress pain responses, reallocate energy, and maintain function long after damage exceeds what is normally survivable. In rare cases, the body does not recover. It continues, not because it heals, but because it never receives the signal to stop. This explanation appears in a 1992 medical journal, buried in a footnote discussing anomalous survival in post-combat populations. The case is referenced obliquely, anonymized, reduced to initials. Even there, the author adds a caveat. Such cases challenge the assumption that death is always a discrete event. Psychologists approached the case differently. They focused on what had disappeared. Witnesses consistently described a man who did not speak about the future, did not express fear of death, and did not behave like someone attempting to survive in any meaningful sense. He complied. He endured. He continued. Modern trauma theory offers terms for this: extreme dissociation, survival automatism, affective shutdown, states in which the self withdraws and the body operates alone. But even within that framework, the case remains uncomfortable. Dissociation is meant to protect the mind, temporarily. In this instance, it appeared to replace it. The most unsettling aspect of the case is not that the soldier died 3 times. It is that no one involved treated this as extraordinary for very long. Each institution reacted in the same way. The military recorded the death and moved on. The medical system documented the failure and closed the file. The civil administration resolved the contradiction by erasing the question. At no point was the possibility entertained that the system itself might be inadequate to describe what had happened. The final note in the 1951 file makes this explicit. Further investigation not recommended. Not impossible. Not untrue. Not disproven. Simply not recommended. There is no evidence that the soldier returned after the 3rd burial. No sightings. No paperwork. No 4th grave. This absence has been interpreted as closure. It may be. Or it may simply be the moment when the system succeeded, not in understanding the man, but in losing him completely. Wars are often described as machines that produce death. Less often discussed is their ability to produce something else entirely. Lives that no longer align with the categories meant to contain them. Men who are dead on paper and alive in flesh. Bodies that function without pain, purpose, or expectation. Survivors who do not return because there is no one left to return as. The soldier who died 3 times was not an anomaly because he survived. He was an anomaly because his survival did not mean living. And when he finally stopped, the relief was administrative, not human. The file closed, the stamps aligned, the dates stopped repeating. History prefers that ending. Because if the story were left open, it would force a far more disturbing conclusion. That under certain conditions, a human being can pass through death so completely that what remains is no longer bound by its rules, only by habit. And habit, unlike life, can persist long after meaning is gone.